Good morning. Today we look at Mark 14, verses 54 through 72. So we finish this chapter. As we finished yesterday's reading, Jesus had been led to the high priest, to all the chief priests, where they were all assembled. So this is at the courtyard at the temple of the Jewish synagogue, and they're all gathered there. And verse 54 starts, Peter had followed at a distance, right into the courtyard of the high priest, and he was sitting with the guards, warming himself by the fire. So it's late enough in the evening and at the time of the year where it was cooler, and they had a fire to warm in the courtyard for all of the people that were there. And remember, now this is the time that this whole crowd of Jews are gathered together for the Passover. So there would be, the hotels that were available would all be filled. It was like when Jesus was born too, but so there were people that were camping in the courtyard. This is where they were staying, and they had fires that were going there, and they were for cooking and for warmth and for everything to imaginable, to sit around and to visit. That's a nice thing that we always do as well. And it says that the chief priests and the whole council were looking for testimony against Jesus so that they might have evidence to condemn him to death. And we need to remember also that the Jewish people, because they were occupied or they were ruled over by the Roman government, the Jewish people, the chief priests and everything, did not have the authority to actually, they could condemn someone to death, but they couldn't carry that sentence out. That had to be done by the Roman government. So they were looking for testimony, but it says they found none. That's verse 55. They found none. For many gave testimony against him, and their testimony did not agree. That's verse 56. And then the next, someone stood and gave false testimony, and they talked about, he said, I will destroy this temple and rebuild it in 3 days without hands. And it says, verse 59, I've got 56 and 59 both underlined but even on this point, they did not agree with him. So 56, their testimony did not agree. And the next, 59, their testimony did not agree. And for evidence to be useful, for evidence to be entered in and to be listened to, there had to be at least two, preferably three people that would testify to the same thing. The testimony of one person wasn't enough. And that's, when Jesus was questioned, his testimony wasn't enough. They needed more testimony than just his. But since they couldn't get any testimony of people to agree, the high priest, who would be Caiaphas at the time, Caiaphas was the high priest, and we know that from other gospels and stuff. I don't know that they mention his name here. I don't remember reading it, but the high priest stands and says to Jesus, "You have no answer? You hear all this testimony? Have you no answer? Aren't you going to refute them? Aren't you going to say anything on your own behalf?" And in verse 51, but he was silent and did not answer. So Jesus heard all these charges against him. He heard the trumped up charges, the false witnesses, everything that was brought against him, and knew that they were, untruths, that they were lies. And, to say something is an untruth is just a little bit of a polite way maybe of saying it's a lie. And we don't like liars. We don't like people that aren't honest that way. And, in so many ways, the chief priests found themselves in that same boat of not truly being honest with things. And then I've got the next part underlined, verse 52, and the first part is 61 and 62. Again, the high priest, Caiaphas, asked him, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" And so the Son of the Blessed One, they would not say Yahweh, because the Jewish people would not mention God's name for fear of having God hear them and check them out. They would refer to him as the Blessed One or the One of Power or, in many terms other than that, but they were very careful not to say, God as we would. And so, are you the Son of the Blessed One? And Jesus said, I am. And I have that I am, underscored 3-4 times, several lines, that this is the time that Jesus comes right out to these religious leaders and says, I am the Messiah. Just remember, he did that with the woman at the well. He said to her, I am he. We are looking for the Messiah, she said. And Jesus said, I am he, the one talking to you. And so Jesus, did admit it. He knew who he was. He always knew who he was. But it was up to other people to figure out for themselves. And then Jesus said, I am, and he continues, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of the power. And here again, the power refers to God. And it's capitalized, like the Blessed One and power are capitalized in my Bible, and that indicates to me that they're referring to God. And you will see me, at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven. And at this, Caiaphas, it says, tore his clothes. And he says, why do we need witnesses? You have heard his blasphemy. So they ask him straight out, are you the Son of God? Are you the Messiah? And when he says, I am, being 100% honest with them, they say it's blasphemy. There's no way that this Jesus could be the Son of God. He's lying. He's speaking an untruth. He's calling himself God. And, but the reality is he didn't commit blasphemy. He was being honest with them. And so it says, what is your decision? He's talking to all of the assembled chief priests, describes all of the religious leaders. And Mark says, all of them condemned him as deserving death. I underline that line in my Bible because in Luke 24:51, I think it is when, when the same thing is going on, it says that, one of the council members, Joseph of Arimathea, was dissenting. He did not. So there's a discrepancy in the Gospels here. Imagine that. They don't 100% agree. But we know, again, we've read, that, Joseph of Arimathea, who had come to believe, along with Nicodemus, came and took Jesus off from the cross. So Mark says that they all agree, but Luke tells us that, Joseph, one of the ruling council of Arimathea, did not agree. So anyway, and then they began to spit on him, to blindfold him, to strike him, and say to him, prophesy. And, I remember, having thought, different, that this part of Jesus' trial and everything, and this first, I used to think that this was in the courtyard of Pilate or of Herod, but this is still going on in the courtyard of the synagogue. This is still going on in front of just the Jewish people and the leaders of the church. And it's the leaders of the church that began to spit on him, to blindfold him, to strike him, to mock him. And then it says the guards took him over and beat him. Because there were guards of the temple. This is, I don't remember that it said, the guards of the temple came, but in Mark's gospel, but other places it refers to the guards of the temple that come to arrest Jesus in the garden. So the guards took him and beat him. And now we go back to Peter. Peter was in the courtyard. Remember that Peter was there warming himself at the fire, is what we started with. And one of the servant girls came by of the high priest, and when she saw Peter warming himself, she stared at him. I love that phrase, she stared at him. She recognized him. She looked at him. Verse 67 is where I'm looking. She stared at him and said, you also were with Jesus. But he denied it. And he said, I do not know or understand what you're talking about. And then it says he went out into the forecourt. So he went from where he was, maybe kind of on the outskirts of the courtyard, and he went up, closer to to get away from her. And then Mark tells us the cock crowed. And then it says, and the servant girl, seeing him, began again to say. So it's the same serving girl that, the first two times says this man is one of them. And Jesus again denies it. And then a little while later, the bystanders again. So here it's the bystanders say, well, you're a Galilean. Surely you are one of them. And Peter denies it. He says, he began to curse and swore an oath. I do not know this man you are talking about. And the cock crows. Think of the pain, the agony that when Peter heard that cock crow, of what he would remember. And it says, then Peter remembered, before the cock crows twice, you will deny me. And this version that I'm reading says that he broke down and wept. The New King James Version said, when he thought about it, he wept. And I thought that when he thought about it, when I first read it, it seemed a little bit, just kind of a nonchalance, when he thought about it. But for here, when it says that he broke down and wept, it's, and some will say he wept bitterly. But when Peter realized the truth of Jesus' words and the truth of his denial, he was filled with remorse. There are times in our lives that it may be kind of difficult to profess that we are Christian, to profess that we have a belief in Jesus. But Jesus will never, never profess that he doesn't love us.